The microphone is still warm, the congregation is still on its feet, the last note still hangs in the air like something holy. And somewhere in that enormous sound, in that wave of worship that has moved millions of people to tears, to healing, to their knees, somewhere underneath all of it, something is quietly breaking. Not the voice, never the voice. The voice was always real. What was breaking was everything else. There is a particular kind of devastation that only happens when the person who taught you to believe in restoration is the one who needs it most. When the man who sang about healing is the one leaving wounds. When the testimony that saved strangers somehow could not save the on-rooms closest to him. That is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. That is something more complicated, more painful, and far more human. That is the story of Donnie McClurkin, and it is not the story most people think they know. Most people know the surface. They know the voice, that enormous, cathedral-filling instrument that could bend a gospel lyric until it sounded less like music and more like prayer. They know the songs, Stand, We Fall Down, Again. Songs that became anthems not because they were polished, but because they bled. Songs that sounded like someone had survived something terrible and was reporting back from the other side. But survival stories have a shadow side that the stage lights don't reach. And the question that now follows Donnie McClurkin wherever his name appears is not about the music. It is about whether the man behind the music ever truly reckoned with the darkness he carried, or whether he simply learned to sing over it. Stop here for a moment. Before the lawsuits, before the allegations, before the headlines that made his supporters go quiet and his critics go loud, you need to understand where this man came from. Because what happened to Donnie McClurkin as a child is not background information. It is the engine of everything that followed. The faith, the fame, the fractures, and the fall. He was born in Amityville, New York in 1959, one of 10 children in a household already acquainted with grief before he was old enough to understand it. The losses came early and they came hard. When Donnie was 8 years old, his little brother Phil was struck and killed by a car. The driver of that car, in a detail so grotesque it almost sounds invented, was their own uncle. The family fractured under the weight of that event in ways that could not be repaired by prayer alone, though prayer was what they reached for. His parents' marriage collapsed, his mother struggled, and Donnie, a boy who had already learned that the world could take someone you love in an instant, was left trying to make sense of a God who permitted such things. Then came something worse. According to McClurkin's own public testimony given in interviews, in sermons, in his autobiography, he was sexually abused by a male relative. He named that abuse as the source of years of private confusion about his identity, his sexuality, his worth. He spoke about it publicly before it was common to speak about such things, and for that, many people respected him enormously. Here was a man, they said, who was honest about his wounds. But here is the detail almost everyone misses. The willingness to testify about a wound is not the same as having healed it. And the gap between those two things, between the public testimony and the private reality, would define much of what came next. The church found him young, or perhaps more accurately, he found the church the way damaged children often do, not as doctrine, but as shelter. Music was the language in which Donnie McClurkin first felt safe, and he was extraordinary at it from the beginning. By his teenage years, he was singing in ways that made adults stop talking. His voice had that rare quality that cannot be manufactured. It carried weight. It carried sorrow. It carried something that sounded less like talent and more like necessity. Eventually, he came under the influence of Andraé Crouch, one of gospel music's most significant figures, and the trajectory of his career shifted dramatically. Crouch saw in McClurkin not just a voice, but a vessel. Someone whose pain had been converted through faith and through music into something that could move people. And he was right. What Crouch perhaps could not have known was how much of that pain remained unconverted beneath the performance. The rise was remarkable by any measure. By the 1990s, Donnie McClurkin was not simply a gospel singer, he was a cultural phenomenon. His 1996 self-titled album announced him to a mass audience. His live performances were events, not concerts in the conventional sense, but something closer to revivals, complete with tears and healings and people speaking about what his voice had done to them in moments of crisis. He sold millions of records. He won Grammy Awards. He became the kind of artist whose music played at funerals and hospitals and prisons. Everywhere human beings are brought to face with what they cannot control. And here is the uncomfortable arithmetic of that kind of fame. When you become a symbol of hope for millions of suffering people, the symbol begins to consume the man. The expectation hardens around you like a shell. People do not come to see Donnie McClurkin the person. They come to experience Donnie McClurkin the testimony. And somewhere inside that transaction, the actual human being, with his unresolved grief, his unexamined wounds, his complicated private life, starts to disappear even to himself. The controversy that would eventually shadow his legacy had its most public early explosion in 2002. That was the year McClurkin appeared at a concert for the Democratic National Committee, an invitation that seemed straightforward until it became clear that his views on homosexuality were at direct odds with the values of many in the Democratic coalition. McClurkin had spoken publicly and repeatedly about his belief that homosexuality could be overcome through faith, rooting that belief in his own testimony about childhood abuse and its aftermath. He was not quiet about it. He was, in fact, forceful about it, using the language of healing and deliverance that is native to Pentecostal theology. The backlash was significant and immediate. LGBTQ advocates and allies called his views harmful. The debate around him intensified in 2008 when Barack Obama's presidential campaign included McClurkin in a concert series in South Carolina, a decision that generated enormous controversy. The campaign attempted to balance the booking by also including openly gay Reverend Andy Sidden on the program, a solution that satisfied almost no one. What matters here is not simply the political controversy. What matters is the pattern it revealed. Donnie McClurkin had built an enormous public identity around the idea that his pain had been transformed, that he was a man who had come through suffering and emerged with a message for others who were suffering. But the message he was delivering on the subject of sexuality was, according to many psychologists, therapists, and people who had lived through what he described, not a message of healing at all. It was, they argued, a message that caused harm to vulnerable young people who were already struggling. And so the question that had always lived in the gap between testimony and reality became louder. How much of what Donnie McClurkin preached had he truly worked through? And how much of it was performance, not in the dishonest sense, but in the sense that the stage had become the only place he knew how to process what he carried? Look at this from another angle entirely. Because this story is not just about controversy, it is about what happens to a man who learns as a child that suffering is the price of love, who learns that the way you earn a place in a room is by surviving something terrible and then making that survival beautiful for others. That is a profound gift. It is also a profound trap. When your value is tied to your wounds, you cannot afford to heal completely. When your testimony is your identity, the testimony must never fully resolve. You must remain in some essential way the boy in the wreckage, because that boy is the one people need. That boy is the one who fills arenas. That boy is the one whose voice makes grown men weep. The mature man, the complicated man, the man with unresolved anger and unexamined patterns, that man is not what the audience paid for. The later years brought turbulence that extended well beyond the culture wars. In 2018, McClurkin was involved in a serious car accident that left him injured and shaken. He spoke publicly about the recovery, again framing suffering in the language of faith and testimony. In some ways, the accident brought renewed sympathy. People who had drifted from his music came back. The narrative reset briefly. Here again was the survivor, the man who had been through fire and was reporting back. But reports of legal and financial difficulties continued to surface around him. Ministry operations drew scrutiny. Questions about accountability and organizational conduct emerged in ways that went beyond the music and the theology. According to various reports and public records, McClurkin faced lawsuits involving financial claims that cast uncomfortable light on the gap between his public ministry and his private operations. The specific legal matters are, as of this telling, complex and ongoing in some cases. What is not complex is the emotional pattern they reveal. A man who had spent decades asking the public to trust him, trust his testimony, trust his faith, trust his interpretation of God's grace, was now facing institutional questions about whether that trust had been properly honored. Here is the detail that cuts deepest, and it is almost always missed in the noise of the controversy. Donnie McClurkin is not a fraud in the simple sense. The pain was real, the faith was real, the voice was real. The people who were moved by his music, who pulled themselves off the floor of addiction, grief, or despair because a song called Stand came on at exactly the right moment, those experiences were real too. They cannot be taken back by scandal. They cannot be undone by lawsuit. But real pain, if it is never properly examined, does not disappear. It finds new forms. It migrates. It shows up in patterns that look nothing like the original wound, but carry the same fingerprint. A man who learned as a boy that he was powerless, that terrible things happened to him without his consent, that the people who were supposed to protect him failed. That man, if he never truly reckons with that powerlessness, will often spend his adult life in an unconscious war against it. He will reach for control. He will reach for authority. He will build structures, ministries, platforms, theologies that guarantee him a position no one can revoke. That is not a character assassination. That is psychology, and it applies to far more people than Donnie McClurkin. The audience that grew up with his music is now facing something deeply uncomfortable. Because the way we love gospel singers, the way we love anyone who seems to embody divine consolation, is rarely clean. We do not love the person. We love what the person represents. We love the feeling their voice gives us. We love the proof they seem to offer that suffering can be transformed into meaning. When that person turns out to be complicated, when the man who sang about healing is himself in need of a different kind of healing, we feel betrayed. And the betrayal is real, but it is also worth asking. Did we ask more of this man than any human being can deliver? Did the worship culture that elevated him, that put him on stages and called him anointed and declared him a vessel, did that culture set him up to fail by never giving him a place to simply be ordinary? There are no easy answers to that, but the question is worth sitting with. The title of this story promises a final sentence, a goodbye forever. And there is a version of Donnie McClurkin's story that ends cleanly. The fall of a once great man, legacy tarnished, career fading, the audience finally turning away. But the truth is less cinematic and more human than that. The truth is that Donnie McClurkin is still alive as of this telling. He is still preaching. He is still singing when his voice allows it. There is still congregations that receive him. There are still people for whom that voice represents something they cannot let go of, because what it meant to them in their darkest moment was not a lie, even if the man behind it is far more complicated than the image allowed. And that is perhaps the most difficult thing the story asks us to hold, that something can be genuinely healing and genuinely harmful at the same time, that a voice can save someone on a Tuesday and fail someone else on a Wednesday, that testimony is not the same as transformation, that a man can know the language of redemption better than almost anyone alive and still be waiting for it himself. Go back to the beginning. The microphone is still warm. The congregation is still on its feet. What you hear in that sound, all that longing, all that faith, all that reaching for something beyond the ordinary, that was never fake. Not the sound itself. The sound was always the truest thing about him. But the sentence that now attaches to his name, the weight of lawsuits, allegations, accusations, the cumulative cost of a life in which public testimony substituted too long for private reckoning, that sentence is real too. And it is the kind that does not get appealed by a great performance. The cruelest irony of Donnie McClurkin's story is that the very thing that gave him his greatest gift, the unprocessed, unconverted pain that made his voice sound like it was reaching from the inside of a wound, may also be the thing that ensured he could never fully outrun what he carried. He turned his testimony into a ministry, but some testimonies need a therapist's office before they need a stage. The goodbye, if it comes, will not be simple, and the people who loved his music will have to decide what to do with the fact that what moved them was real, even if the man who made it was never quite what they needed him to be. Some stories in gospel music carry that same impossible weight, the collision of extraordinary talent, traumatic origin, and a culture that sanctifies the wound rather than treating it. If you want to understand how faith and fame can conspire to protect a public image at the expense of private truth, there are more names in that room than Donnie McClurkin, and some of those stories are even darker than this one.